Chapter 1. The Man Who Shouldn't Have Been Alive. There is a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar, and inside it, in 1957, archaeologist Ralph Solecki made a discovery that should have been impossible. He found a man. Or rather, he found what was left of one, bones approximately 46,000 years old, belonging to a Neanderthal who had lived a life that, by every known rule of prehistoric survival, should have ended decades before it did. The right arm was withered and useless, almost certainly amputated below the elbow either by injury or deliberate removal. The right side of the skull showed damage consistent with a blow that had likely destroyed vision in one eye. The bones of the legs showed evidence of repeated injury and healed fractures. This was a man who could not hunt, could not gather, could not fight, could not run. In a world where every calorie had to be earned through physical effort, where the difference between eating and starving was the ability to move fast and hit hard, this man was, by any cold utilitarian calculation, a liability. And yet the bones tell a different story, because the bones are old, very old. He did not die young, the way a man with those injuries should have died if he had been left to manage alone. He survived. For years. Which means someone fed him, someone protected him from predators. Someone made sure that when the group moved, he moved with them. Someone, in a world we like to imagine as brutal and unforgiving, decided that this broken man was worth keeping alive. When Solecki published his findings, the implications were uncomfortable for a field that had spent decades constructing a narrative of our ancestors as essentially Darwinian machines, efficient, unsentimental, governed entirely by the logic of survival. That narrative was neat. It was satisfying. It explained a lot. And it was, the bones suggested, at least partly wrong. But here is the thing that Solecki's discovery raises, the question that almost nobody asks when they hear this story. The man in the cave had a withered arm. His difference was visible, physical, something that everyone around him could see and understand. He was still clearly himself. The same person, the same mind, just a body that had been damaged. And his community kept him anyway. So the question is this: what did they do with the ones whose damage was invisible? What happened when it wasn't the body that broke, but the mind? What happened to the ones who started hearing voices that no one else could hear, seeing things that no one else could see, speaking in ways that disconnected from the shared reality of the group? What happened, in other words, to the ones we would today diagnose as mentally ill? The answer to that question turns out to be one of the most surprising, most complicated, and most human stories in the entire history of our species. And it begins not with the history of medicine, not with the history of psychiatry, not with the history of any institution we have ever built, but with the history of the brain itself, and the uncomfortable truth that the same architecture that allowed us to build civilizations is the same architecture that can, under certain conditions, turn catastrophically against itself. Because mental illness did not appear with modernity, it did not arrive with the stress of industrial capitalism or the anxiety of social media or the alienation of contemporary life, however real those pressures are. It is not a product of anything we have created. It is a product of what we are. And that changes everything about how we should think about the history of how we have treated it, and the history of how we have failed. The bones in Shanidar Cave are 46,000 years old. The story they tell is still being written, and in the next chapter, we'll begin to understand why the same brain that made us the most successful species on Earth is also the brain that 1 in every 100 of us will experience, turning against itself. Not because something went wrong, but because of something that went extraordinarily, terrifyingly right. Chapter 2. The brain that turns on itself. There is a number that should stop you cold the moment you hear it, and it is this: 1%. Roughly 1% of every human population ever studied, every culture, every century, every civilization from the earliest recorded history to the present day, experiences schizophrenia. Not approximately 1% in wealthy countries, and less in poorer ones. not 1% in industrialized societies, and 0 in traditional ones. 1% everywhere. Always. Without exception. The Yanomami people of the Amazon, the pastoral communities of rural Mongolia, the fishing villages of coastal Iceland, the urban centers of contemporary Tokyo and Lagos and São Paulo. 1 in every 100 people. Which means that right now, in any room of 100 people, statistically one of them is living inside a reality that the other 99 cannot access. Hearing voices, seeing things, operating according to a logic that from the outside appears fractured and from the inside is entirely, terrifyingly coherent. And if that is true now, it was true 50,000 years ago. It was true 100,000 years ago. It was true at every campfire, in every cave, in every early human settlement that ever existed. In a band of 50 people, the typical size of a Paleolithic social group according to the anthropological work of Robin Dunbar at the University of Oxford, one of them was, statistically, experiencing something the others could not see. And that fact raises a question so uncomfortable that most of us never ask it directly. What did those other 49 people do about it? Before we can answer that, we need to understand something that our culture actively resists understanding, which is that mental illness is not a modern invention. This is not obvious. The way we talk about mental health in contemporary discourse carries an implicit assumption that something about modern life, the pace, the disconnection, the pressure, the screens, the noise, is producing levels of psychological suffering that our ancestors never experienced. And there is some truth in that. Specific modern conditions do produce specific modern forms of distress, but the underlying architecture of serious mental illness, the psychoses, the profound depressions, the manias, the schizophrenias, these are not products of modernity. They are products of the human brain itself. The same brain that allowed us to develop language, to imagine futures that don't yet exist, to build cathedrals and compose symphonies, and develop the germ theory of disease. That same brain, in approximately 1% of cases across all populations and all times, turns on itself. Not because something external went wrong, because of something internal to the architecture of what we are. The neuroscientist and psychiatrist E. Fuller Torrey, whose decades of research into schizophrenia are summarized in his landmark work Surviving Schizophrenia, first published in 1983 and now in its 7th edition, has argued that the very cognitive advances that made humans unique, the expanded prefrontal cortex, the capacity for abstract thought, the ability to model complex social realities, came with an inherent vulnerability. The more powerful the system, the more catastrophic the failure mode. A simple calculator cannot crash in a way that destroys everything it was running. A supercomputer can. The human brain is the most powerful information processing system that evolution has ever produced, and in a small but statistically consistent fraction of cases, that power turns inward and begins to consume itself. This is not metaphor. This is neurobiology. The specific mechanisms differ between conditions. The dopamine dysregulation associated with schizophrenia, the serotonin and norepinephrine disruptions associated with severe depression, the complex neurochemical cycling associated with bipolar disorder, but the underlying principle is the same. These are not character flaws. They are not spiritual failures. They are not the products of weak will or difficult childhoods, though those things can exacerbate them. They are malfunctions in the most complex organ that has ever existed, occurring with the same statistical regularity that any complex system produces malfunctions in its most sophisticated components. And they have been occurring, at that same rate, for as long as the brain has been organized the way it currently is, which is to say, for at least 300,000 years, and probably longer. Which means that every generation of humans that has ever lived has had to answer the same question, not whether mental illness exists. It always has. But what to do about it? What to make of it? How to understand it? How to treat the people who experience it? And the answers that different cultures have given to those questions across thousands of years and hundreds of civilizations form one of the most illuminating and most disturbing stories in the entire history of the human species, because the answers have ranged from profound compassion to systematic brutality, from sophisticated clinical insight to magical thinking, from genuine healing to torture conducted in the sincere belief that it was medicine. And often, more often than we like to admit, all of those things have existed simultaneously, in the same culture, in the same institution, sometimes in the same room. But before we get to the institutions, before we get to the doctors and the priests and the reformers and the dungeons, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to those 49 people sitting around a fire, watching the 50th member of their group speak to things that aren't there. Because what those people decided to make of what they were seeing, the framework they reached for when ordinary reality failed to explain what they were witnessing, that decision shaped everything that came after it. And in the next chapter, we'll discover that the most consistent answer ancient humans gave to the mystery of madness was not fear, not abandonment, and not violence. It was something far more surprising, far more sophisticated, and in its own way far more humane than anything the modern world managed to produce for most of its history. Chapter 3. The Ones the Spirits Chose. There is a moment that anthropologists have documented across dozens of unconnected cultures on every inhabited continent, a moment that occurs with such consistency that it has its own name in the academic literature, and it goes like this. A young person in a traditional community begins to behave strangely. They stop sleeping. They wander at night. They speak about things no one else can perceive. They report hearing voices, seeing visions, receiving messages from entities that exist outside the boundaries of ordinary reality. They may become agitated, ecstatic, terrified, or all three in rapid succession. They may stop eating. They may spend days in states that look, from the outside, like complete disconnection from the shared world everyone else inhabits. In the modern world, this presentation would trigger a specific clinical response. A psychiatrist would listen to the description of symptoms, consult the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and arrive at a diagnosis somewhere in the spectrum of psychotic disorders, most likely schizophrenia, or a first psychotic episode that may or may not resolve into something more chronic. The person would be referred for medication, probably antipsychotics, possibly hospitalization. The framework would be medical. The language would be clinical. The goal would be symptom reduction and stabilization. And in the ancient world? In the ancient world, across cultures that had never heard of each other, separated by oceans and mountain ranges and thousands of years, the response was remarkably, strikingly, almost universally the same. This person has been chosen. The voices they are hearing are real. The visions they are seeing are messages. The disconnection from ordinary reality is not a malfunction. It is a doorway. And this person, this frightening, unpredictable, sleepless, wandering, voice-hearing person, is the most important individual in the community. They are the shaman. The word itself comes from the Tungus languages of Siberia, saman, meaning one who knows. But the concept is so widespread, so consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other, that anthropologists have largely stopped treating it as a cultural borrowing and started treating it as an independent human discovery. Eliade's foundational work, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, published in 1951 and still one of the most comprehensive cross-cultural studies of the phenomenon ever written, documented the shaman figure in the indigenous traditions of Siberia, Central Asia, North and South America, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and Africa, finding in each case a figure whose role was defined by the ability to move between the ordinary world and an invisible world beyond it, to communicate with forces that normal people could not perceive, to mediate between the living and the dead, between the community and whatever lay beyond the horizon of ordinary experience. And in virtually every case, the anthropological record shows that the shaman's vocation began not with a deliberate choice, but with what we would today recognize as a psychiatric crisis. The Siberian shamanic tradition is perhaps the most extensively documented. Among the Yakut people of northeastern Siberia, the shamanic calling was called the shaman sickness, a period of profound psychological disruption, often lasting months or years, during which the future shaman experienced visions, heard voices, sometimes lost the ability to eat or sleep, sometimes appeared to others to be on the verge of death. This period was understood not as illness but as initiation. The spirits were not destroying the person. They were remaking them, tearing them apart so that something new and more capable could be reassembled from the pieces. The shaman who emerged from this crisis was not broken. They were transformed. They had survived something that would have killed an ordinary person, and that survival was itself the proof of their power. The Inuit Angakwit, the shaman figures of the Arctic, went through a similar process. The Mongolian Bö, the Korean Mudang, predominantly women who entered shamanic practice through episodes of what was called sinbyong, a spirit sickness characterized by hallucinations, physical symptoms, and profound psychological disruption. The Ayahuascaros of the Amazon, the Sangomas of southern Africa, the Balians of Bali. The specific vocabulary differs, the cosmological framework differs, but the underlying structure is the same. A person whose mind works differently from the norm, who experiences realities that others cannot access, who passes through a period of profound psychological crisis, and who emerges from that crisis with a social role that places them at the center rather than the margins of the community. This is not a small thing. This is not a footnote in the history of psychiatry. This is the dominant framework through which the majority of human beings who have ever lived made sense of what we now call psychosis. And that framework had consequences that we are only beginning to understand in clinical terms. In 2015, a research team led by Tanya Luhrmann at Stanford University published a study in the British Journal of Psychiatry that compared the subjective experience of auditory hallucinations, hearing voices, across 3 cultural contexts: the United States, Ghana, and India. All participants had received a diagnosis of schizophrenia. All were experiencing auditory hallucinations. The content of their experiences, the neurobiology underlying those experiences, was in clinical terms identical. What was not identical was how they experienced those voices. In the United States, participants almost universally described their voices as intrusive, threatening, alien, meaningless, something attacking them from outside, something to be fought and suppressed. In Ghana, many participants described their voices as the voices of God or ancestors, sometimes frightening, yes, but also sometimes helpful, sometimes comforting, embedded in a framework of meaning that gave the experience a purpose and a place. In India, the picture was similar. Voices that were frightening but also sometimes experienced as visitors, as presences that could be negotiated with rather than simply endured. Same diagnosis, same neurobiology, completely different subjective experience. Because the story a culture tells about the voices shapes what the voices feel like from the inside. And the story that traditional cultures told, the story that these experiences are messages, that the person having them is chosen rather than broken, that the voices are real even if no one else can hear them. That story did something clinically significant. It reduced the terror. It gave the experience meaning. It placed the person inside a community framework where their difference was not a reason for exclusion, but a reason for a specific kind of inclusion, a specific kind of status, a specific kind of care. The shaman was not abandoned. The shaman was fed, housed, protected, consulted. Their needs were met by the community precisely because their condition was understood as a gift that the community required. This is not to romanticize what was, in many cases, genuine suffering. The voices heard by someone experiencing schizophrenia are real in the sense that they are neurologically generated and subjectively experienced as external, but they are not messages from the spirit world. The visions are not divine revelations. The shamanic framework was a story, a powerful and genuinely helpful story in many cases, but a story nonetheless. And it did not always work. There were shamans who deteriorated rather than stabilized, who could not be integrated into the community framework, no matter how hard the community tried, whose illness was simply too severe and too unrelenting to be contained by any cultural narrative. There were also cultures where the framework was not benevolent, where the person experiencing psychosis was understood not as chosen, but as possessed, not as a vessel for helpful spirits, but as a host for malevolent ones, and where the response was not care, but something much darker. But here is what the cross-cultural evidence consistently shows. The communities that had a framework for making meaning out of extreme psychological states, a framework that placed the person experiencing those states inside a role rather than outside the community, produced better outcomes, measured in survival, in social integration, in the subjective quality of the experience itself, than the communities that had no such framework, or whose framework was defined primarily by fear. The ancient world was not uniformly kind to its mentally ill. But in this one respect, in the decision to look at a person whose mind worked differently and find a use for that difference, rather than simply a reason for exclusion, it was sometimes more sophisticated than the modern world managed to be for most of the past 3 centuries. And in the next chapter, we'll look at the moment when that sophistication began to crack. When the framework of meaning that had given psychosis a place in the human community was replaced by something older and much darker, and what was done in the name of healing became indistinguishable from what was done in the name of punishment. Chapter 4. The story changes what the illness feels like. There is an experiment that most people in psychiatry know about, and almost nobody outside of it has heard of, and it is one of the most important pieces of research produced in the last 30 years, not because of what it found about mental illness specifically, but because of what it found about the relationship between culture and subjective experience, about the degree to which the story a society tells about suffering shapes what that suffering actually feels like from the inside, not metaphorically, not philosophically, but neurologically, measurably, in ways that show up in clinical outcomes and survival rates and the texture of daily life for the people living inside those experiences. The study was conducted by Tanya Luhrmann and her colleagues at Stanford University, published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2015, and its methodology was straightforward in the way that the best research always is. They found people in 3 different countries, the United States, Ghana, and India, who had all received a clinical diagnosis of schizophrenia, who were all experiencing auditory hallucinations, who were all, by any standard diagnostic measure, dealing with the same condition. And then they sat with those people and asked them, in careful detail, to describe what the voices were like. Not whether they heard voices, that was already established, but what the voices said, what they felt like, whether they were frightening or familiar, whether they seemed to come from inside or outside, whether they had identities, personalities, histories, whether they ever said anything helpful, and what they found should have rewritten the way psychiatry thinks about psychosis. In the United States, the picture was almost uniformly bleak. Participants described their voices as intrusive, hostile, alien, something that attacked them from outside themselves, something with no relationship to their inner life, something that needed to be fought and suppressed and medicated into silence. The voices commanded. They threatened. They said things that were disturbing and random and disconnected from anything the person experiencing them recognized as meaningful. They were, in the words of one participant, like having a stranger inside your head who hates you. In Ghana, the picture was different in ways that were difficult to overstate. Many participants, not all, but many, described their voices as familiar. As the voices of God, or of ancestors, or of known spiritual beings whose presence in their lives had a context, a history, a framework of meaning that made even the frightening aspects of the experience navigable. Several participants described receiving helpful information through their voices, instructions that turned out to be useful, warnings that proved accurate. One woman described a voice that told her to clean her house before guests arrived, and the guests arrived. The voice was frightening sometimes. Yes, but it was not alien. It was not random. It was not meaningless. It existed inside a framework that her culture had given her, a framework that said these experiences are real, they have a source, they have a purpose, and you are not broken for having them. In India, the pattern was similar. Voices that were sometimes terrifying, but also sometimes experienced as visitors. Presences that could be negotiated with, that had identities and temperaments and histories, that existed in relationship with the person hearing them, rather than simply attacking them from an incomprehensible void. And across all three contexts, the clinical implications were significant. The American participants showed higher levels of the specific kind of psychological distress associated with the experience of voices as alien and threatening. The Ghanaian and Indian participants, on average, showed lower levels of that specific distress, not because their illness was less severe, not because they were experiencing fewer hallucinations, but because the hallucinations were embedded in a framework of meaning that changed what they felt like from the inside. Same brain, same diagnosis, same neurobiology, completely different experience. Because the story matters. The story changes everything. And this finding, which Luhrmann has expanded and deepened in subsequent research, including her 2020 book, How God Becomes Real, which examines the mechanisms through which cultural frameworks shape inner experience, has implications that reach far beyond psychiatry, implications that force us to reconsider everything we think we know about the history of how human beings have treated mental illness across time. Because if the story a culture tells about psychosis can change what psychosis feels like from the inside, then the stories that ancient cultures told, the shamanic framework, the framework of divine possession, the framework of spirit contact, were not simply superstitions layered on top of an experience that remained constant beneath them. They were active interventions. They were, in the most literal sense, treatments. Imperfect treatments, yes? Treatments that were based on a completely wrong understanding of the underlying neurobiology. Treatments that could not address the root cause of what was happening and could not prevent deterioration in the most severe cases. But treatments nonetheless. Treatments that worked through the mechanism of meaning, that took an experience of terrifying, fragmenting, reality-dissolving chaos and gave it a place, a purpose, a framework, a social role, a reason to be survived rather than simply endured. And then, at a certain point in human history, that treatment was withdrawn. Not gradually, not thoughtfully, not replaced by something better. It was withdrawn because the framework that had generated it, the framework that said these experiences come from the spirit world and have meaning and are, in their own terrifying way, gifts, was replaced by a different framework, one that was in some ways more sophisticated and in other ways catastrophically crueler. That replacement happened in multiple stages, in multiple cultures, over multiple centuries. But one of its most dramatic and most consequential moments occurred in Europe during the Middle Ages, when the complex, ambivalent, sometimes compassionate framework that had allowed ancient cultures to find a place for extreme psychological states was swept away and replaced by something that permitted, that actively required, a level of violence toward the mentally ill that had rarely been seen before and would not be surpassed until the 20th century. But before we get to the darkness of that period, we need to spend a moment with the people who tried to prevent it. The physicians, the philosophers, the scholars who looked at psychosis and said, not demon, not spirit, not divine punishment, brain. The people who were right 2,000 years before anyone had the tools to prove it, and who were ignored almost completely for most of that time. Because the history of psychiatry is not only a history of what was done to the mentally ill, it is also a history of what could have been done, and wasn't, and why. And it starts in a garden in ancient Greece, with a physician who had the audacity to suggest that the brain was an organ like any other, that it could be sick like any other, and that sick things could, with the right treatment, sometimes be healed. That physician's name was Hippocrates. And what he said in the 5th century before the Common Era was so radical so threatening to the dominant frameworks of his time that it would take the Western world more than 2,000 years to fully accept it. And in the next chapter, we'll find out exactly what he said, and why the world wasn't ready to hear it. Chapter 5, Holes in the Skull. There is a skull in the collection of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris that is approximately 7,000 years old, and it has a hole in it. Not a hole made by a weapon, not a hole made by an animal, not a hole made by the ordinary processes of decay and time. A hole made deliberately by a human hand using a stone tool while the person whose skull it was still alive, and the edges of the hole are smooth, rounded, healed, which means the person survived. Someone drilled a hole through a living human skull 7,000 years ago, and the person with the hole in their head lived through it, recovered from it, and went on to live long enough for the bone around the opening to begin the slow process of biological repair. We have found skulls like this on every inhabited continent, from Peru to France to China to Tanzania. The oldest are more than 10,000 years old. Some skulls have not one hole but 2 or 3, or in one extraordinary case from ancient Peru, 7 separate trepanations performed on the same individual at different points in their life. Each one healed, each one survived, each one evidence of a person who submitted to this procedure repeatedly and lived. The procedure is called trepanation or trepanation, and it is the oldest known surgical intervention in human history, and one of the most debated questions in paleoneurology, the study of ancient brains and ancient brain treatment, is why it was performed. The answers that researchers have proposed fall into roughly 2 categories, and the tension between them illuminates something important about the ancient relationship between physical suffering and psychological suffering, between the body and the mind, between what can be seen and what cannot. The first category of explanation is straightforwardly medical in a way we can recognize. Trepanation to relieve pressure after a head injury. Trepanation to drain a subdural hematoma. Trepanation to address the symptoms of severe chronic headaches or epilepsy by releasing whatever was building up inside the skull. These explanations are supported by evidence. Many trepanned skulls show associated injuries, fractures, lesions that suggest the procedure was performed in response to something physically wrong with the brain beneath. And the survival rates are, frankly, astonishing. Modern analysis of trepanned skulls suggests that somewhere between 50 and 90% of patients survived the procedure, depending on the time period and the technique used. In ancient Peru, where the practice was most widespread and the techniques most refined, survival rates may have approached 80%, comparable to some surgical outcomes in the early modern period, achieved without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without germ theory, without any of the conceptual framework that we associate with the ability to keep a surgical patient alive. The second category of explanation is harder for the modern mind to sit with comfortably. Trepanation to release evil spirits. Trepanation to create an opening through which whatever had taken possession of the person's mind could escape. Trepanation as a treatment not for physical injury, but for psychological disruption, for the symptoms of what we would today recognize as serious mental illness. This explanation is supported by a different kind of evidence, the cultural and religious context in which trepanation was practiced in many societies, the association in numerous traditions between drilling holes in the skull and the expulsion of spiritual entities believed to be causing madness, and the simple fact that many trepanned skulls show no associated physical injury whatsoever, no fractures, no lesions, no evidence of the kind of trauma that would justify a purely medical intervention, suggesting that the procedure was performed for reasons that were not, in our terms, medical at all. And here is the thing that should make us pause before we dismiss this second category of explanation as simply primitive and misguided. Because even in the cases where trepanation was performed to release evil spirits, even in the cases where the conceptual framework was entirely supernatural and entirely wrong, The person performing it had to acquire real skills, had to learn through practice and observation and the accumulated knowledge of a tradition, how deep to drill and where and at what angle. Had to understand, at some functional level, the difference between the bone of the skull and the membrane beneath it and the tissue of the brain itself. Had to manage bleeding and infection with whatever materials were available, had to monitor the patient afterward, assess their recovery, intervene if something went wrong. In other words, they had to care. Not in the modern clinical sense, not with the conceptual tools that allow us to understand what they were doing and why it sometimes worked and why it sometimes didn't. But in the most basic sense, they stayed. They watched. They tried. They kept the person alive through a recovery that must have been, by any measure, agonizing. And the fact that so many patients survived, the fact that the healed bone around those ancient holes is evidence not just of a procedure, but of an aftercare, a sustained attention to a vulnerable person's recovery, tells us something that matters enormously for understanding the full arc of how humans have treated mental illness. It tells us that even in the framework of spirit possession, even in the framework that was most conducive to abandonment and most likely to produce violence, the basic human impulse to stay and watch and try did not disappear. It just got expressed through different tools and different justifications. The tools were wrong. The justifications were wrong. The procedure, in the cases where it was performed for psychological rather than physical reasons, almost certainly did nothing to address the underlying condition. But someone stayed. Someone cared enough to try. And that pattern of trying, of staying, of refusing to simply let the suffering person disappear is, as we will see, far more consistent across human history than the opposite pattern, even in the periods we think of as the darkest. But the darkness is real, and we should not minimize it, because alongside the trepanation, alongside the shamanic care, alongside the ancient communities that fed and protected their broken members, there was also something else. There was fear. There was the very human tendency to respond to what is not understood with violence, to treat the inexplicable as threatening, to confuse suffering with danger and difference with menace. In ancient Mesopotamia, the texts we have recovered describing what we would recognize as mental illness, the cuneiform tablets of the Diagnostic Handbook compiled by the scholar-physician Esagil kin Apli in approximately 1050 BCE and analyzed by historian of medicine Joanne Scurlock in her essential 2014 work Sourcebook for Ancient Mesopotamian Medicine, describe conditions of the mind in terms that oscillate between medical observation and supernatural explanation with a fluidity that is itself revealing. A person who hears voices might be described in one passage in terms that are almost clinically precise: the specific character of the hallucinations, the pattern of the episodes, the associated behavioral changes, and in the next passage attributed to the anger of a specific deity or the malevolence of a specific class of demon. And the treatments recommended follow the same dual logic: herbal preparations alongside ritual incantations, dietary interventions alongside exorcism ceremonies, the kind of structured care that might genuinely help alongside the kind of magical intervention that certainly didn't. This duality, the simultaneous presence of genuine clinical observation and supernatural explanation, of real care and dangerous ritual, of compassion and fear, is not unique to Mesopotamia. It is the defining feature of the ancient world's relationship with mental illness across virtually every culture we have enough records to examine. Ancient Egypt, whose medical traditions are documented in the Ebers Papyrus of approximately 1550 BCE and the Edwin Smith Papyrus of similar date, shows the same pattern. Sophisticated descriptions of psychological states, what we would recognize as depression, as mania, as psychosis, alongside treatment recommendations that combine what looks like genuine therapeutic insight with what looks like magical thinking. The instruction to sit with the patient and talk with them. The instruction to provide structure and routine. The instruction to give them tasks that connect them to the community. These are not primitive superstitions. These are in their essential logic, recognizably therapeutic. They are what a thoughtful clinician might recommend today, and they exist in the same document as instructions to recite specific incantations and perform specific rituals to drive out the spirit causing the disturbance. Ancient Greece, which we will examine in more detail in the next chapter, presents the most dramatic version of this tension, because it was in ancient Greece that someone finally made the radical move of separating the two sides of the equation, of saying clearly and explicitly that the supernatural explanation was wrong, that the brain was an organ, that mental illness was a medical problem, and that medical problems had medical solutions. That person was Hippocrates, and what he said, and what happened to what he said, and why it took so long for the world to act on it, that is one of the most important and most neglected stories in the entire history of medicine. And it begins, as so many important stories do, with someone being willing to say something that everyone around them believed was not just wrong, but dangerous. In the next chapter, we'll find out exactly what Hippocrates said, what the world did with it, and how the most powerful institution in Western history managed to bury it for more than 1,000 years. Chapter 6. The First Psychiatrists. There is a text that is approximately 2,500 years old, written by a physician working in ancient Greece, and it contains a sentence that should have changed everything. The sentence reads, in its most direct modern translation, as follows: Men ought to know that from the brain, and from the brain only arise our pleasures, joys, laughter, and jests, as well as our sorrows, pains, griefs, and tears. And it is through the brain that we think and understand and see and hear, and distinguish the ugly from the beautiful, the bad from the good, the pleasant from the unpleasant. And it is the brain that makes us mad and delirious, that fills us with dread and fear, whether by night or by day, that brings us sleeplessness and inopportune mistakes, aimless anxieties, absent-mindedness, and acts contrary to habit. The author of that sentence was Hippocrates of Kos, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, in a text called On the Sacred Disease, the sacred disease being epilepsy, which was at the time understood to be a form of divine possession, a condition caused by the intervention of gods in the neural architecture of the afflicted. And what Hippocrates said about epilepsy in that text was so radical, so fundamentally threatening to the dominant framework of his time, that simply stating it clearly required a kind of intellectual courage that is difficult for us, living in a world where his position is simply assumed to be correct, to fully appreciate. He said, "This disease is no more divine than any other. It has a natural cause, and its cause is in the brain, 2,500 years ago, without a microscope, without neuroimaging, without the germ theory of disease or the concept of the neuron or any of the tools that we associate with the ability to make that kind of claim with confidence." Hippocrates looked at a person experiencing what we now know to be a complex neurological event and said, correctly, that the cause was physical, located in a specific organ, treatable through physical means. He was right. And for most of the next 2,000 years, the world did not care. This is the central tragedy of the history of psychiatry. Not that no one ever understood that mental illness was a medical problem, but that someone understood it very early, said so clearly, and was then largely ignored while the world organized itself around frameworks that produced outcomes ranging from inadequate to catastrophic. To understand why, you have to understand the intellectual world that Hippocrates was operating in, and the institutional world that would eventually determine whose ideas survived and whose didn't. The Greece of Hippocrates was a world in profound intellectual ferment. The pre-Socratic philosophers had already begun the project of explaining natural phenomena without reference to divine intervention. Thales arguing that the fundamental substance of the universe was water, Anaximander proposing something more abstract, Democritus developing an early version of atomic theory. The move toward naturalistic explanation was underway. Hippocrates was part of that tradition, applying its logic specifically to medicine, arguing that diseases had natural causes and therefore natural treatments, that the physician's job was to understand those causes and address them through observation, intervention, and the systematic accumulation of clinical knowledge. His description of what we would today call psychiatric conditions is, even across the distance of 2.5 millennia, recognizable and precise. He described what we call depression, a persistent state of fear and despondency that he called melancholia, attributing it to an excess of black bile, which was wrong in its mechanism, but right in its insistence that the condition was physical rather than spiritual in origin. He described mania. He described what reads unmistakably like postpartum psychosis, documenting in careful clinical detail the pattern of symptoms, their timing relative to childbirth, their typical progression and resolution. He described conditions of the mind with the same methodical observational precision that he brought to conditions of the body, because for him there was no meaningful distinction. The mind was what the brain did, and the brain was an organ, and organs could be sick, and sick organs could be treated. His recommended treatments were, by the standards of the time, genuinely reasonable. Rest, structured routine, dietary modification, physical exercise, baths, the reduction of stimulation for those who were agitated, the increase of stimulation for those who were withdrawn. What he was recommending was not, in its essential logic, far from what a thoughtful modern clinician might recommend as adjuncts to medication, and he was recommending it without medication, which means he was recommending it as the primary intervention, which means he had somehow arrived, through observation and inference alone, at a set of practices that aligned with a modern understanding of how to support a distressed nervous system. He was not alone. Galen, the physician who dominated Roman medicine for centuries after his death in approximately 216 CE, built extensively on the Hippocratic tradition, developing a more elaborate theory of the relationship between physical states and psychological ones, documenting case studies of patients with what we would recognize as psychiatric conditions, and arguing consistently for a physical rather than supernatural understanding of their causes. Asclepiades of Bithynia, practicing in Rome in the 1st century BCE, went further than almost anyone before him in developing what we might recognize as humane psychiatric care, recommending light, music, gentle exercise, and structured social interaction for his patients, explicitly rejecting the use of physical restraint except in cases of immediate danger, arguing that the mentally ill deserved the same quality of care as the physically ill and that better care produced better outcomes, which was an empirical observation as much as a moral position. Aristeas of Cappadocia, writing in the 2nd century CE, produced descriptions of mania and depression that are so clinically precise, so carefully observed, so attentive to the longitudinal pattern of what we now call bipolar disorder, the cycling between states, the periods of apparent normality between episodes, the way the condition typically presented differently in different individuals, that they were still being cited as clinically relevant by psychiatrists in the 19th century, 1700 years after they were written. These were not primitive guessers. These were careful observers developing a genuine clinical science under conditions of almost complete theoretical darkness, without the tools to understand the mechanisms underlying what they were seeing, but understanding what they were seeing with a precision and a compassion that puts much of what followed them to shame. And what followed them was the Middle Ages. What followed them was the collapse of the institutional and intellectual framework that had made their work possible, the replacement of naturalistic explanation with supernatural explanation across virtually every domain of knowledge, and the specific application of that supernatural framework to mental illness in ways that produced some of the most sustained and systematic cruelty in human history. The transition was not immediate. It was not even complete. The tradition of naturalistic medicine persisted in the Islamic world long after it had been marginalized in Christian Europe, and we will return to that story. But in the European context, the collapse was real, and its consequences were severe. When the framework that said mental illness is a disease of the brain was replaced by the framework that said mental illness is evidence of demonic possession or divine punishment. The entire set of practices that the Hippocratic tradition had developed became not just irrelevant, but actively suspect. Rest and structured routine and gentle exercise were not what demons required. What demons required was confrontation, expulsion, the application of spiritual force sufficient to overcome whatever supernatural power had taken hold of the afflicted person. And the methods developed to accomplish that confrontation ranged from the merely ineffective to the genuinely monstrous. Exorcism at its most benign was a ritual performance, prayers, incantations, the invocation of divine authority against the possessing entity that probably did something like what the shamanic framework did, providing a structure of meaning within which the person experiencing psychosis could locate their suffering and, sometimes, stabilize. At its worst, it was something else entirely: prolonged isolation, starvation. On the theory that if the body was made sufficiently inhospitable, the demon would abandon it, beating, burning, immersion in freezing water, methods that would today be recognized without hesitation as torture, and that were conducted with the sincere conviction that they were medicine, that the suffering inflicted on the body was a form of mercy to the soul trapped inside it. And yet, and this is the part that the simple narrative of medieval darkness tends to obscure, even in this period, even in the framework most hostile to genuine care, the other impulse persisted. Because alongside the exorcisms, alongside the violence, there were the monasteries. There were the religious communities that ran something far closer to hospitals than to prisons, that took in the mentally ill, housed them, fed them, gave them structure and routine and, sometimes, something approaching genuine care, not because they understood what was wrong in any medical sense, but because they believed, with complete sincerity, that every human being was made in the image of something sacred, and that whatever had happened to the mind, the person inside it remained, and remained worthy of dignity. The most remarkable example of this parallel tradition is perhaps the colony of Geel in what is now Belgium, where from at least the 13th century onward, mentally ill people from across Europe were received into the homes of ordinary families and integrated into the normal life of the community, working, eating, participating, living alongside people who were not ill in a structure of radical normalization that anticipated by 7 centuries the community mental health movement of the 20th century. Geel is still operating today. It has been continuously providing what it calls family care for the mentally ill for more than 800 years. Through the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, through the rise and fall of institutional psychiatry, through everything. 800 years of ordinary families opening their homes to people whose minds worked differently, because a tradition said that this was the right thing to do. And it worked. The outcomes for patients in the Geel system, documented by researchers including Jan Goldstein in her important 1987 study Console and Classify, the French psychiatric profession in the 19th century, were consistently better than the outcomes in the formal psychiatric institutions of the same period, not because the families of Geel understood anything about neurobiology, but because they provided what the neurobiology apparently requires: safety, routine, human connection, the experience of being a person in a community rather than a patient in an institution. And in the Islamic world, during the same centuries when European psychiatry was organized primarily around exorcism and containment, something else was happening entirely, something that deserves to be far better known than it is. In 705 CE, the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid I established in Damascus what is generally considered the first dedicated psychiatric hospital in human history. The Beimaristan, a word meaning house of the sick, an institution specifically designed for the care of people with mental illness, staffed by physicians trained in the Hippocratic and Galenic traditions that the Islamic world had preserved and extended while Europe had largely abandoned them. The physicians of the Islamic Golden Age approached mental illness with a sophistication that was, in many respects, more advanced than anything European medicine would produce until the 19th century. Al-Razi, known in the Latin West as Razes, practicing in Baghdad in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, classified mental illnesses systematically, distinguished between different types of psychosis, developed what we would recognize as differential diagnosis, and argued with characteristic directness that mental illness was a disease of the brain that required physicians, not priests, and treatment, not exorcism. He was saying in the 9th century what Hippocrates had said in the 5th century BCE, and what the mainstream of European medicine would not fully accept until the 20th century. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose canon of medicine, completed in approximately 1025 CE, would remain one of the most widely used medical textbooks in both the Islamic world and Europe for more than 5 centuries, devoted extensive attention to psychiatric conditions, describing them with clinical precision, proposing treatments that combined physical intervention with what we might recognize as early psychotherapy. The physician sitting with the patient, attempting to understand the content of their experience, engaging with the logic of their delusions, not to dismiss it, but to gradually redirect it. He described a case that reads remarkably like what we would today call a patient with a delusion of grandiosity, a man who believed he was a cow and demanded to be slaughtered. And his treatment of that patient, as he describes it, involved neither physical restraint nor exorcism, but a careful, sustained engagement with the patient's own framework of reality, gradually introducing information that contradicted the delusion while maintaining the therapeutic relationship. It is, in its essential structure, recognizably cognitive. It is, in other words, psychiatry, practiced in Baghdad in the 11th century. The Bimaristans that spread across the Islamic world, in Cairo, in Aleppo, in Marrakesh, in Fez, were not perfect institutions. They reflected the limitations of their time and their culture in ways that a modern clinician would find troubling. But they were, fundamentally, hospitals, places where sick people were brought to be treated rather than contained, where the goal was recovery rather than management, where the framework was medical rather than supernatural, and they existed centuries before Europe managed to produce anything comparable. The first psychiatric hospital in Europe, the Hospital des Innocents, founded in Valencia in 1409 by a Franciscan friar named Juan Gilabert Joffre, was established partly in response to a tradition of Islamic medical care that had filtered into Spain through centuries of contact. It was a beginning, a fragile, imperfect beginning, but a beginning. And from that beginning, over the following centuries, a new institutional framework for mental illness would gradually take shape across Europe, a framework that would reach its fullest and most terrible expression in a building on the edge of London that became so notorious that its name entered the English language as a synonym for chaos itself, a building called Bethlehem. And in the next chapter, we will go inside it. Chapter 7. Bedlam. There is a word in the English language that everyone knows and almost nobody knows the origin of, and it is Bedlam, meaning chaos, uproar, a scene of wild confusion, a situation so disordered and so loud and so beyond the reach of any organizing principle that it defies description in any more precise terms. And the word comes from a place, a specific building that stood on the edge of London for centuries, and that became so synonymous with a particular kind of human suffering that its name detached itself from its origin and entered the general vocabulary as a descriptor for disorder itself, the way that a brand name sometimes becomes the word for the thing the brand makes, except that what Bedlam made was not a product but a spectacle, and what the spectacle was made of was human beings, in the worst moments of their lives, displayed for the entertainment of people who had paid for the privilege of watching. The full name of the institution was the Bethlehem Royal Hospital. It had been founded in 1247, initially as a priory, and had begun admitting mentally ill patients sometime in the 14th century, making it one of the oldest psychiatric institutions in Europe and certainly the most famous, though famous is not quite the right word because what Bethlehem became over the course of its long and complex history was not famous in the way that a great university or a great cathedral is famous, through the accumulation of achievement and the positive reputation that achievement generates, but infamous, notorious, its name a shorthand for everything that could go wrong when a society decided that its most vulnerable members were someone else's problem and organized an institution around the management of that problem in the cheapest and most expedient way available. By the 17th century, Bethlehem had become something that is genuinely difficult to describe without sounding as though you are exaggerating for effect, and the difficulty is compounded by the fact that the primary sources, the accounts of visitors, the records of the institution itself, the testimony of former patients who were eventually coherent enough to describe what had happened to them, are so consistent in their portrait of what went on inside those walls that exaggeration is not necessary. The institution charged admission. People paid a penny in the early period, more as the practice became more organized, to walk through the wards and observe the patients, not to speak with them, not to assist them, not to provide any form of human contact or care, but to observe them, as one might observe animals in a menagerie, as a form of entertainment, as a reminder of the fragility of reason and the comfort of being, oneself, on the right side of the bars. The visitors came in considerable numbers. Estimates suggest that in some periods Bethlehem received more paying visitors per year than many of the most popular tourist attractions in London, and the visits were considered, by the standards of the time, a perfectly acceptable form of recreation, something you might do on a Sunday afternoon with your family, something that prominent citizens, respectable tradespeople, and even aristocrats participated in without apparent embarrassment or moral discomfort. Samuel Johnson visited. Horace Walpole wrote about it. Alexander Pope referenced it in the Dunciad. The word Bedlam, already drifting loose from its institutional moorings, appears in Shakespeare. The spectacle of madness had become a cultural institution as much as a medical one, and the medical institution had organized itself, consciously or not, around the requirements of the spectacle, which meant that the patients were managed in ways that made them more visible, more dramatically disturbed, more likely to produce the kind of display that visitors had paid to see. They were often chained, not because chaining was the most effective way to prevent them from harming themselves or others, though that was the justification, but because chaining confined them to the areas where they could be most easily observed. They were often underfed, not necessarily through deliberate cruelty, but through the systematic neglect of an institution that had no financial incentive to invest in the well-being of people whose suffering was its primary product. They were often unwashed, often underdressed, often left in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable for animals in a well-run stable. And when you read the accounts of former patients who were eventually discharged and eventually recovered enough to describe their experience, what comes through most consistently is not the violence, though there was violence, but the loneliness, the disorientation, the experience of being looked at constantly and never once seen, of existing as an object of fascination rather than a subject of care, of being inside an experience of profound psychological crisis with no one around who was interested in anything except the dramatic external presentation of that crisis. John Percival, the son of a British Prime Minister, was admitted to a private madhouse in 1830 and eventually to Bethlehem, and his account of the experience, published in 2 volumes in 1838 and 1840 under the title A Narrative of the Treatment, experienced by a gentleman during a state of mental derangement, is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of psychiatry. Not because it is unusual in what it describes, but because it is unusually articulate, because Percival was a man with the education and the social connections and the eventual recovery sufficient to write a book about what had happened to him. And what he describes is an institution organized entirely around the management of bodies rather than the treatment of minds, in which the staff were largely untrained, largely indifferent, largely focused on maintaining order rather than producing recovery, and in which the concept of the patient as a person with an inner life worth attending to was so completely absent from the institutional culture that it had apparently never occurred to anyone to consider it as a possibility. The specific abuses that Percival describes, the mechanical restraints, the cold baths, the isolation, the administration of purgatives and emetics that left patients physically exhausted on top of their existing psychological distress, were not unique to Bethlehem, and they were not, by the standards of the time, considered abusive. They were the standard treatments of early 19th century psychiatry, practiced across Europe and America with the confidence of people who believed they understood what they were doing and the indifference of people who did not particularly care whether it was working. The cold bath was believed to shock the nervous system back into proper functioning. The purgatives were believed to clear whatever physical imbalance was producing the psychological disturbance. The mechanical restraints were believed to protect both patients and staff. The isolation was believed to calm the agitated mind. Each of these interventions had a theoretical justification that made sense within the framework of medical knowledge available at the time. None of them worked. Some of them actively worsened the condition they were intended to treat. And the people practicing them had no reliable way to know this, partly because the theoretical framework was wrong, and partly because the institutional culture of the period had no mechanism for systematically evaluating outcomes, no commitment to following patients over time to see whether what had been done to them had helped or harmed, no feedback loop between what was being practiced and whether it was producing recovery. The institution existed to contain. Whether it also healed was, in a structural sense, beside the point. And yet, even in Bedlam, even at the lowest point of the institutional history of psychiatric care, something persisted that we have seen persisting throughout this entire story, that keeps appearing in the most unlikely places, that refuses to disappear no matter how hostile the environment becomes. There were people who cared. Not the institution. The institution was organized around different priorities, but individual people inside the institution who looked at the patients in their charge and saw not spectacles but sufferers, not objects of management but subjects of experience, not problems to be contained but people who were in pain and who deserved something better. Edward Wakefield, a Quaker philanthropist who visited Bethlehem in 1814, and was so disturbed by what he saw that he brought it to the attention of a parliamentary committee, described finding a patient named William Norris, who had been kept in mechanical restraints, a device of his own design apparently, improvised by the staff, for an extended period of time that Wakefield estimated at more than a decade. Norris was found in a small cell, chained to a wall by an iron bar around his neck, and a series of restraints that limited his movement to a radius of approximately 12 inches. He had been in this condition for so long that his body had adapted to it. He could not fully straighten when the restraints were finally removed. Wakefield's account of this visit, delivered to the parliamentary committee investigating conditions in madhouses, was one of the pivotal moments in the history of British psychiatric reform. Not because it revealed something previously unknown, the conditions at Bethlehem were not secret, but because it produced, finally, a level of public outrage sufficient to motivate institutional change, and because it arrived at a moment when several reformers were already working, from different directions and with different methods, toward the same end. Those reformers, Philippe Pinel in France, Dorothea Dix in America, William Tuke in England, are the subjects of the next chapter, and they deserve more attention than history has generally given them, because what they did was not simply argue for better conditions inside existing institutions, though they did that too, but challenge the fundamental conceptual framework that had produced those conditions. The framework that said the mentally ill were a category of person for whom the normal standards of human dignity did not apply, and replace it with something that looks, at this distance, both revolutionary and obvious. They said, "These are people. Treat them like people. See what happens." And what happened when they tried it was so dramatically different from what the existing framework had produced that it forced a confrontation with everything the field thought it knew, and that confrontation, and what came of it, and why it took so long, and how much was lost in the time it took. That is where we are going next. Chapter 8. The Reformers. Nobody remembers. There is a man named William Tuke who almost nobody has heard of, and who changed the history of psychiatry more profoundly than almost anyone whose name you do know, and the story of how he did it begins not with a grand theory or a revolutionary text or a political movement, but with a single death that nobody could adequately explain. In 1790, a Quaker woman named Hannah Mills was admitted to the York Asylum in northern England. She was experiencing what the records describe as a severe mental disturbance, the specific nature of which is not documented in sufficient detail to allow retrospective diagnosis, but which was serious enough that her family felt unable to care for her at home and made the decision, which must have been agonizing, to place her in institutional care. The York Asylum was not, by the standards of the time, considered a particularly bad institution. It was not Bethlehem. It was a provincial asylum operating within the normal parameters of early psychiatric practice. Mechanical restraints, cold baths, purgatives, isolation, the standard armamentarium of a field that had not yet seriously questioned whether its standard treatments were actually treating anything. Hannah Mills died inside the York Asylum 6 weeks after her admission. She was not allowed visitors during those 6 weeks. Her family never saw her again after she passed through the doors. The cause of death was recorded in terms vague enough to be meaningless, and the circumstances of her final weeks were, as far as her family and the broader Quaker community could determine, completely opaque. William Tuke was a tea merchant, a Quaker elder, a man with no medical training whatsoever, and no particular prior interest in psychiatric care. And he was so disturbed by Hannah Mills's death and by his inability to find out what had happened to her that he went to the York Asylum and asked to see the conditions under which its patients were kept. He was refused, and that refusal, the casual institutional confidence of people who knew that what was happening inside their walls could not survive outside scrutiny and had organized their institution accordingly, was the thing that turned William Tuke from a concerned private citizen into a reformer. He could not get inside the asylum, so he decided to build something different outside it. In 1796, after 6 years of fundraising and planning within the Quaker community, the York Retreat opened. It was, in its physical appearance, deliberately designed to look nothing like an asylum. It was a country house set in gardens, surrounded by farmland. Patients were called guests, staff were called attendants, not keepers. There were no chains, no mechanical restraints as a routine measure, no cold baths, no purgatives used as primary interventions. There was instead something so radical that contemporaries who visited and wrote about what they saw consistently used the word remarkable. There was kindness. Structured kindness, yes. Kindness organized around a clear framework of routine and expectation, because Tuke had observed, with the practical eye of a man who ran a successful business, that people in acute psychological distress often responded well to clear structure and consistent routine. But kindness nonetheless. The patients at the York Retreat worked in the gardens. They ate meals together. They were addressed by their names. They were expected to behave according to the norms of ordinary social life, not because those norms were imposed through force, but because they were supported in meeting them, because the environment was organized around the assumption that they could meet them, that they were capable of ordinary human behavior, that their illness was not the totality of what they were, and the outcomes were different. Not perfect, the York Retreat was not a cure for serious mental illness, because serious mental illness does not have a simple cure. But the outcomes were measurably, demonstrably, consistently better than the outcomes being produced by institutions that used mechanical restraint and physical punishment as their primary tools of management. Patients recovered more often. They recovered more completely. They returned to their communities at higher rates. The length of their episodes, measured from admission to discharge, was shorter. Tuke documented all of this with the methodical precision of a businessman tracking the performance of an investment, because that is what it was. An investment in a different model of care, and the returns on that investment were sufficiently clear to constitute, if not a scientific proof, at least a powerful empirical argument that something important was happening at the York Retreat that was not happening elsewhere. Samuel Tuke, William's grandson, published a description of the retreat in 1813 under the title Description of the Retreat, an institution near York for insane persons of the Society of Friends, and the document, which is essentially a clinical report embedded in a moral argument, circulated widely and became one of the foundational texts of what would eventually be called moral treatment, the approach to psychiatric care that placed the therapeutic relationship, the physical environment, and the basic dignity of the patient at the center of the treatment model, rather than at its periphery. Across the Channel, working independently and arriving at similar conclusions through a different route, Philippe Pinel was conducting what became perhaps the most famous single act in the history of psychiatric reform. Pinel was a French physician, trained in the Hippocratic tradition, who had become convinced through clinical observation that the treatments being applied to mentally ill patients in the institutions of revolutionary France were not only ineffective, but were actively worsening the conditions they were supposed to treat. In 1793, appointed as physician-in-chief at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris, he did something that his contemporaries regarded as either courageous or insane, depending on their prior commitments. He ordered the removal of the chains from the patients in his charge. The story, as it has been told in the subsequent historiography, Pinel striding into the dungeons of Bicêtre, personally striking the chains from the limbs of suffering patients who had been restrained for years or decades, patients falling to their knees in gratitude, the dramatic before and after of enlightenment confronting barbarism, is, like most dramatic historical narratives, a simplification that contains a truth but obscures a complexity. The unchaining at Bicêtre was not a single dramatic event, but a process, extended over time, negotiated with a skeptical institutional hierarchy, implemented cautiously and incrementally by Pinel and his colleague Jean-Baptiste Poussin, who deserves more credit than he typically receives for the practical implementation of what Pinel is credited with conceiving. And the results were not a simple story of liberation producing recovery, because some patients, when unrestrained, were dangerous to themselves or to others, and Pinel had to develop new methods of managing those situations that did not depend on chains. But what the process demonstrated, consistently and clearly enough to be persuasive to people who had previously believed that mechanical restraint was the only viable way to manage severely mentally ill patients, was that many patients who had been restrained on the grounds that they were unmanageable without restraint became, when the restraint was removed, considerably more manageable. The restraint had been producing the very behavior it was intended to control. The chains had been creating the violence they were supposed to prevent. And when the chains came off, and when the patients were treated with something approaching ordinary human dignity, and when the institutional environment was reorganized around the assumption that they were people rather than animals, the violence diminished. Not disappeared, diminished. Enough to constitute a clinical finding, enough to force a reconsideration of everything the field thought it knew about why its patients behaved the way they did. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the most important figure in 19th-century psychiatric reform was a woman who had no medical training, no institutional affiliation, no political power of any conventional kind, and who changed the conditions of psychiatric care for more people than almost any physician of her era. Dorothea Dix was a schoolteacher from Massachusetts who in 1841, while teaching a Sunday school class at a Cambridge jail, discovered that mentally ill people were being housed in the jail's unheated cells, not because they had committed crimes, but because there was nowhere else to put them, because the existing institutions were full or too expensive, or simply not available in the communities where these people lived. What Dix saw in that jail, the conditions, the cold, the casual brutality of a system that had organized itself around the assumption that the mentally ill were a category of person for whom ordinary standards of human treatment did not apply, produced in her a response that she described in her own writings as a kind of conversion experience, a moment in which the scale and nature of a problem became suddenly, undeniably clear, and in which the obligation to respond to it became equally clear. She spent the next several years traveling through Massachusetts, visiting jails and almshouses and private madhouses, documenting what she found with a precision that reflected both her pedagogical training and her instinct for the kind of evidence that could not be dismissed. She found mentally ill people in cages, in cellars, chained to walls in outbuildings, in conditions that were, in the literal physical sense, worse than the conditions maintained for livestock on the same properties. She found people who had been in restraints for so long that their muscles had atrophied, and their joints had stiffened, and they could no longer straighten their limbs. She found people who had received no human contact beyond the minimum necessary to keep them alive, in some cases for years. In 1843, she presented her findings to the Massachusetts state legislature in a document called Memorial to the Legislature of Massachusetts, which begins with a sentence that has become one of the most frequently quoted in the history of American social reform. I come to present the strong claims of suffering humanity. The memorial is a remarkable document, a clinical report, a moral argument, and a political brief simultaneously, organized around the evidence that Dix had personally collected and written with a controlled precision that makes its contents more rather than less devastating. It produced results. The Massachusetts legislature expanded the state asylum at Worcester, and Dix, recognizing that what she had found in Massachusetts was not unique to Massachusetts, extended her survey across the country, presenting similar memorials to the legislatures of more than 30 states, and eventually to the United States Congress, and the cumulative effect of those presentations was the largest expansion of psychiatric institutional capacity in American history up to that point. 32 state hospitals established or expanded as a direct result of her advocacy, affecting the conditions of care for hundreds of thousands of people. She then took her campaign to Europe, presenting her findings to governments in Scotland, France, Italy, and eventually meeting with Pope Pius IX, who in response to her advocacy ordered reforms in the Papal States' treatment of the mentally ill. The scope of what Dorothea Dix accomplished, measured in institutions built and conditions improved, and people whose experience of psychiatric care was made materially better by her interventions, is almost without parallel in the history of social reform. She is not famous. She does not appear in most history textbooks in more than a footnote. Her name is not attached to a monument or a holiday or a commonly used word or concept. She was a schoolteacher from Massachusetts who looked at something that everyone around her had decided to look away from, and decided that looking away was not something she was willing to do. And what she found, and what Tuke found, and what Pinel found, all of them working in different countries with different tools and different methods, but arriving at the same essential conclusion, that the mentally ill were people, that people responded to dignity, that institutions organized around dignity produced better outcomes than institutions organized around containment. What all of them found was not a cure. It was something more fundamental than a cure. It was a principle. The principle that how you treat a suffering person changes what happens to them. That the environment of care is not a neutral backdrop to the real treatment, but is itself the treatment, or at least an essential component of it. That a person experiencing the most extreme and most disorienting form of psychological suffering is still a person, still responsive to the same things that all persons respond to safety, to routine, to human connection, to the experience of being seen and addressed as someone whose inner life matters. This principle seems obvious when stated plainly. It is so obvious that it is difficult, at this distance, to understand why it required 3 reformers working independently across 3 countries over the course of several decades to establish it against the resistance of a field that was genuinely convinced it knew better. But the history of psychiatry is full of things that seem obvious in retrospect and were deeply contested in their time, and the principle of moral treatment was one of them, contested not by people who were cruel by nature or indifferent by character, but by people who had organized their understanding of mental illness around a framework that made the principle invisible, that made the patient into a category rather than a person, and then designed institutions around the management of the category. And that framework, the framework that had made Bedlam possible and had kept it operating for centuries, did not simply disappear when Tuke and Pinnell and Dix demonstrated that a different framework produced better outcomes. It retreated. It adapted. It found new justifications and new institutional forms. And in the next chapter, the final chapter, we will see where it retreated to, and what it looks like now, and what the 46,000-year-old bones in a cave in Iraq still have to tell us about who we are and how far we have yet to go. Chapter 9. We still haven't got this right. There is a statistic that should be impossible to ignore, and that most people manage to ignore without difficulty. And it is this. Depression is currently the leading cause of disability worldwide, affecting more than 280 million people according to the World Health Organization's most recent global assessment, and of those 280 million people, the majority, in most countries, the vast majority, are not receiving any treatment at all. Not inadequate treatment, not the wrong treatment, no treatment. They are managing, or failing to manage, entirely alone inside an experience that we have had the conceptual tools to address for at least 2,500 years, since Hippocrates first said that the brain is an organ, and that organs can be sick, and that sick things can sometimes be healed. We have known this for 2,500 years. We are still not doing it. And the question of why, the question of what it is about mental illness specifically, as opposed to other forms of human suffering, that makes it so persistently undertreated, so consistently underfunded, so reliably pushed to the margins of public concern, even as its prevalence and its consequences become impossible to deny. That question turns out to have an answer that runs through everything we have examined in this story, from the cave in Iraq, to the shamanic traditions, to the dungeons of Bedlam, to the reforms of Tuke and Pinnell and Dix and back again. And the answer is not primarily about money, though money is part of it, and not primarily about knowledge, though the gaps in our knowledge are real, but about something older and more fundamental than either. It is about fear, the specific, particular ancient fear of the mind that has turned on itself, of the person whose inner world has become disconnected from the shared reality that the rest of us depend on as the most basic infrastructure of social life, of the experience that is closest to us and most threatening to us because it is located not in the body, which can break without threatening the self, but in the self, which is the only place we actually live. This fear is not irrational. It is not a product of ignorance, though ignorance amplifies it. It is a response to something genuinely frightening. The evidence that the thing we most depend on, the thing that makes us who we are, the organizing principle of every experience we have ever had, can fail, can dissolve, can turn against itself in ways that leave the person experiencing it stranded in a reality that no one else can access, and that they themselves did not choose and cannot easily escape. That is frightening. It has always been frightening. It was frightening 46,000 years ago when the community around the man in Shanidar Cave looked at whatever was happening to a member of their group and had to decide what to do about it. It was frightening when the Paleolithic band watched the future shaman begin to hear voices and had to choose between exclusion and integration. It was frightening when the medieval exorcist faced a patient whose illness wasn't responding to his rituals and had to decide how much more forceful his intervention needed to become. It was frightening when Tuke's neighbors told him he was insane for proposing to house dangerous lunatics in a country house with no chains. It is frightening now, in a world that has neuroscience and pharmacology and decades of clinical research, and still manages to look away from the scale of the suffering in its midst, with a consistency that is itself a kind of collective decision, a repeated, renewed institutional choice to prioritize other things. The fear has never gone away. What has changed over the course of the story we have traced is the framework through which the fear is processed, the story that cultures tell about what madness is and where it comes from, and what it requires of those who are not experiencing it. And the history of that framework is not a simple arc from superstition to science, from darkness to enlightenment, from the brutal past to the more humane present. It is something more complicated and more honest than that. It is a history of the same tension, repeated in different forms across every culture and every century. The tension between the impulse to care and the impulse to contain, between the recognition that the mentally ill are people and the desire to manage them as a category, between the knowledge that what is happening to them is real and the wish that it were happening somewhere else. Consider the history of deinstitutionalization, which is the story of what happened to the institutional psychiatric system built by reformers like Dorothea Dix, when the mid-20th century produced both a genuine pharmacological revolution and a political movement that decided the solution to bad psychiatric institutions was no psychiatric institutions. The pharmacological revolution was real and important. The development of chlorpromazine in 1952, the first antipsychotic medication, represented a genuine breakthrough, a treatment that could reduce the severity of psychotic symptoms in ways that nothing before it had achieved, that could make it possible for people with serious mental illness to live outside institutional settings in ways that had previously been impossible. The political movement that accompanied and followed this breakthrough was less straightforwardly beneficial. In the United States, the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, signed by President John F. Kennedy, represented a genuine commitment to replacing the large state hospital system with a network of community mental health centers that would provide comprehensive outpatient care for people with serious mental illness living in their communities. It was, in its conception, an attempt to implement on a national scale exactly what Tuke had demonstrated at the York Retreat, the principle that people with mental illness could live in communities rather than institutions if those communities provided adequate support. The state hospitals began to empty. Hundreds of thousands of people who had been living in institutional settings were discharged into communities that were supposed to receive them with the support systems necessary to sustain them there. Those support systems were never adequately funded. The community mental health centers were built at a fraction of the promised rate. The medications that made community living theoretically possible were not consistently available to the people who needed them. And the result was not the liberation that reformers had hoped for, but something that looks, from the distance of half a century, like the most recent iteration of the oldest pattern in this story. A large population of people with serious mental illness who needed sustained, organized support being left to manage without it, not through deliberate cruelty, not through the conscious decision that they did not matter, but through the familiar mechanism of deciding that they were someone else's problem, that the next level of government, or the next budget cycle, or the community itself would figure it out, and then moving on to other priorities. The result is visible on the streets of every major city in the developed world. Approximately 1/3 of the homeless population in the United States has a serious mental illness. The largest provider of psychiatric care in many American cities is not a hospital or a community health center, but a jail, a fact that would not have surprised Dorothea Dix, who encountered the same situation in 1841 and spent the next several decades of her life trying to change it. We have made a partial circle. The progress is real. The pharmacological tools available today are genuinely more effective than anything previous generations had access to. The conceptual framework is more sophisticated. The worst institutional abuses of the Bedlam era have been eliminated from mainstream practice in most developed countries. But the circle is only partial, and the part that remains unclosed is not a technical problem awaiting a technical solution. It is the same problem that has been waiting, unresolved, at the center of this story since the beginning. The problem of deciding, as a community, as a society, as a civilization, that the people whose minds work differently are still people, and that the obligation to care for them does not diminish when caring for them becomes expensive or inconvenient or politically unrewarding or simply very hard. That decision keeps having to be made. It keeps being unmade. It keeps having to be made again. And here is what 46,000 years of evidence tells us about that decision. It tells us that the impulse to make it, the impulse to stay, to watch, to feed the person who cannot feed themselves, to protect the person who cannot protect themselves, to keep alive someone who by any cold utilitarian calculation should not still be alive, is not a modern invention. It is not a product of civilization or philosophy or organized religion or any of the frameworks that humans have built to explain to themselves why they should care about each other. It precedes all of those things. It is older than language, older than burial, older than art. The man in Shanidar Cave, who died 46,000 years ago with a withered arm and a missing hand and damage to his skull that had likely taken one of his eyes, did not survive because the Neanderthals who surrounded him had read Hippocrates, or attended the York Retreat, or been persuaded by Dorothea Dix's memorial to the legislature. He survived because the people around him decided, without any framework to justify the decision, that he was worth keeping. That is the oldest human instinct we have evidence for. Not the instinct to build, not the instinct to worship, not the instinct to create art or accumulate knowledge or organize societies, the instinct to stay with the person who cannot manage alone, and the history of mental illness, the full, long, complicated, frequently terrible history that we have traced from the Paleolithic, through the shamanic, through the classical, through the medieval, through the institutional, through the reform and the counter-reform and the deinstitutionalization and the present moment, is, underneath all of its complexity, a history of that instinct in tension with another instinct that is equally old and equally human. The instinct to protect the group from what threatens it, to draw a boundary between the normal and the abnormal, to decide that some categories of suffering are too strange or too frightening or too expensive to be everyone's responsibility. These two instincts have been in tension for as long as we have been human. They will probably remain in tension for as long as we continue to be human. The question that the evidence poses, the question that the bones in the Iraqi cave and the healed trepanation holes and the records of the York Retreat and the memorials of Dorothea Dix and the research of Tanya Luhrmann and the statistics of the World Health Organization all converge on asking, is not whether we can eliminate that tension, because we probably cannot. The question is which instinct we choose to organize our institutions around, because institutions are not neutral. They are crystallized decisions about which instinct to prioritize. Bedlam was a crystallized decision. The York Retreat was a crystallized decision. The Community Mental Health Act was a crystallized decision. The underfunding of community mental health services in every subsequent budget cycle was a crystallized decision. Every time a person experiencing a psychiatric crisis ends up in a jail cell rather than a hospital bed, that is a crystallized decision. Every time a family is told that the waiting list for outpatient psychiatric care is 6 months and that there is nothing available in the meantime, that is a crystallized decision. Every time a policy is designed around the assumption that mental health care is a luxury rather than a basic component of a functional healthcare system, that is a crystallized decision. We are making these decisions constantly. We are making them with the full weight of 46,000 years of evidence about what happens when we make them well and what happens when we make them badly. The evidence is not ambiguous. The communities that found a framework for keeping their broken members alive, whatever that framework was, however wrong its theoretical underpinnings, however imperfect its practice, produced better outcomes than the communities that didn't. The institutions that organized themselves around the dignity of their patients produced better outcomes than the institutions that didn't. The cultures that told a story, that gave meaning to extreme psychological states, produced better subjective experiences for the people living inside those states than the cultures that told a story organized around fear and exclusion. The evidence is consistent. It has been consistent for as long as we have had evidence, and we keep not acting on it. Not because we don't know, not because the tools don't exist, but because the other instinct, the instinct to draw the boundary, to decide that this particular category of suffering is someone else's problem, to look away from what is frightening and difficult and expensive, keeps winning the institutional argument, keeps determining where the money goes and where it doesn't, keeps shaping the systems that determine what actually happens to the people who need help most. The man in Shanidar Cave had people around him who made a different choice. We don't know who they were. We don't know what they believed. We don't know what story they told themselves about why he was worth keeping alive. We just know that they stayed. And the question that his bones ask, across 46,000 years of silence, is whether we are still the kind of people who stay. The answer right now, in the world as it currently exists, is sometimes. In some places, for some people. Not consistently enough, not systematically enough. Not as if we had actually decided, as a civilization, that the answer should be yes. But the instinct is there. It has always been there. It has survived everything that has been done to suppress it. Every framework of fear, every institution of containment, every budget decision that said this is not a priority. It keeps surviving. Because it is, apparently, as fundamental to what we are as the brain that sometimes breaks, and the community that sometimes imperfectly, stubbornly, across 46,000 years of trying and failing and trying again, decides to hold the broken person anyway. We came from people who stayed. The question is whether we will be people who stay. That question has never been more answerable than it is right now, and we have never been less certain of the answer.